Just want to say good morning. My name is Tim Callgreen, and welcome to the Indiana Bar Foundation's 2020 We the People Institute. We're excited that so many teachers are able to join us over the next 2 days. And so we hope that you're going to find this to be useful to learn content, teaching strategies that you can bring back to your classroom. Traditionally, this institute takes place in the summer over 5 days for an in-depth, immersive workshop in content, pedagogy techniques, and an introduction to the We the People program. And so unfortunately, because of our circumstances in the coronavirus, we've moved this institute online. And so because of this medium shift, we recognize that we aren't going to be able to introduce you to the We the People program as much as we would have liked to if we were in person. So everybody should have at least received a one-page introductory flyer about the program and your confirmation email. So I'll let you look over that and let me or one of the regional coordinators or one of our mentor teachers know if you'd like more information on how to add We the People teaching into your teaching toolbox. So to look over today, we're going to start with our scholar's presentation, and he's going to speak until 10:30 Eastern, 9:30 Central. Afterwards, we're going to take a short break and then split into breakout groups so you can work with a mentor teacher about bringing what you learned back into your classroom. So I know this isn't anyone's first Zoom meeting since this pandemic hit, but just a few best practices to remind everybody. Please keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking. You can choose to keep your video on or off. That's your preference. You might want to choose to hide non-video participants so blank boxes don't take up any valuable real estate on your screen as well. If you haven't done so, if you could rename yourself to add your grade level teaching at the end of your name so we can make sure that we have that information too. During the presentation, if you have any questions along the way, especially for our presenter, go ahead and post them in the Zoom chat box. We're going to go ahead and monitor those questions, and at pausing points, we'll call on you to ask the questions. With that, we're excited to introduce today's speaker, which is Dr. Robert Dion. Dr. Dion is an associate professor of political science in the Engelhardt Chair at the University of Evansville, where he's taught American politics since 2001. Before he came to the University of Evansville, he's taught at Syracuse University and Wabash College. Outside the classroom, Dr. Dion serves as the chairperson of the local Civil Rights Commission, and he's on the board of several organizations. He's quoted regularly in news stories about political developments in Indiana and the United States. He's appeared frequently on radio and television news programs, and Dr. Dion has been a friend of and a presenter for the Indiana Bar Foundation for over a decade, as best as we can tell. And so it's great to have you back and with this, Dr. Dion. And so speaking on checks and balances, are they working? Indiana Bar Foundation is pleased to present Dr. Robert Dion.
Well, thank you very much, and I hope you guys can all hear me. I saw applause there, thanks. It's fun looking at this gallery view. Of course, it's not as good as being in person in Bloomington and being able to read the room, but it sure is nice to see some familiar faces. I see some really first-rate teachers here, and I understand that there are some new people as well. So as Tim suggested, as we go along, I'm going to shift to PowerPoint here in a moment. And if you have questions, please feel free to jump in the chat and direct questions that way. And Tim is authorized to interrupt me at any time if there's something that seems pressing or if it comes up later. I've got the daunting task of talking about checks and balances in the space of 90 minutes or less. And so it's hard to get your arms around the whole thing, but I'll try to give you a broad brush set of ideas, big points, maybe a few details, and hopefully that'll be of some help to you. I'm on a bill this summer with your speaker tomorrow, Ms. Monk, who is Constitution Lady, which is so cool, and I should come up with a name for myself because I don't have one. So maybe you can help me with that in the chat. Checks and balances cheerleader, checks and balances champion. Please don't say chump. So there you go. Let me see if I can put this PowerPoint on and we can dive right in. All right. That's not what I want, is it? Yes, it is. Okay, hopefully you can see the slide and you can hear my voice, and we can proceed from here. This is the Indiana Summer Institute, of course, and my topic for today is checks and balances. But first, as always, I want to say a couple quick things about the Summer Institute and the We the People program. First of all, as Tim suggested, I am a huge fan of the We the People program. We didn't have it when I was in high school, but then again, we didn't have plumbing. We didn't have electric heat. But the minute I heard about the We the People program, I fell in love with it. It's been, I think, close to 15 years or more that I've been working with local students or going to the state finals or helping with these institutes. It is really a treasure. It is so vital and so needed at a time like this. And it always warms my heart to be in the company of teachers. I know we have a mix of middle school and high school and elementary teachers, but everything that you do is so important and so very useful. It's really striking how low America rates when it comes to civic knowledge, civic involvement, civic engagement. We've got to do better. Anytime you read or you study the founding and you think about the system that was designed back then, the engine, the gas that runs the engine is people and informed and engaged citizenry. That's what makes the whole thing work. And so to the extent that you're helping students learn about the government and their role in it, I really do believe that it is really, really important. And I don't know that you could be doing anything more important. I like to think that when I teach American government, I'm giving these young people skills that they can use for the rest of their lives. As long as they live, they'll be able to use this because they're citizens in this country. So all that is to say that I really believe in We the People, and I appreciate what you're doing. The thing I like about the We the People program, for what it's worth, I'm endlessly impressed with the teachers, but also the students. And I know it's a competition, and I know it's, exciting in that respect. But when all is said and done, whether you came in first or whether you came in last, those students know something that they can use. And so, in my view, there are no losers in We the People. Everybody comes out a winner, including the parents, the families, the communities. It's a terrific program. All right. So today I want to talk about checks and balances. I looked around on the internet, and of course I've been teaching this since my first college class was 1991. So soon enough it'll be 30 years of instruction at the college level. And I'm familiar with the kinds of things that are in circulation. So I put this one that I came across on the internet up on the screen here. And it basically says our government was created with 3 equal branches and a system of checks and balances to make sure that no one branch can ever become too powerful. I hope that for you, this is a familiar idea. I hope that for many, if not most of you, this is also in a lot of ways a wrong-headed idea. This is the wrong way to think about checks and balances for a variety of reasons. And if we were in a room together, I would just wait and let you guys think it through and then shout back answers to me, but we're not going to do that, sorry. Obviously, one of the deficiencies here is 3 equal branches. The We the People textbook makes clear that we don't have 3 equal branches. We never did, and that's by design. The founders did not want the branches to be equal. And so for starters, anytime you come across something that talks about 3 equal branches, that should set off a red flag for you. The other area where I think this is troublesome is the make sure part. Sometimes people say make certain or to ensure. Yeah, not so much. Not so much. That's an overstatement, I think, to make sure that no branch can ever become too powerful in the last 230 years. That's an overstatement. That's a capitulation to dogma or doctrine that I don't think is helpful. The goal is to try to prevent branches from getting too powerful or intruding on the other branches, but as far as it being a sure thing or a guarantee, that to me is problematic, and I hope that'll become clear over time. So I looked at the Britannica online, and I'm not in love with this definition either, but it's better. What is checks and balances? It's a principle of government under which separate branches, we have separate co-equal branches, separate branches are empowered to prevent actions by other branches and are induced to share power. To my mind, that's much better. A lot of scholars of the Constitution talk about separation of powers, but when they talk about it, they tell us that we have separate institutions that share power. They have to work together in order for anything to happen. So there is an inducement to share or to collaborate. Of course, in real life, that doesn't always happen. So I like that last part. And then the prior bit there that says the branches are empowered to prevent actions by other branches. I think subsumed in there is the notion that they are empowered to do it, but that doesn't mean they're going to do it. And so the operative question this morning is, are checks and balances working? It's not the question of do we have checks and balances? Obviously we do. We have a government under which separate branches are empowered to prevent actions by other branches. That doesn't mean they're doing it. And so I like the latter definition. You can look it up under Britannica. The first one, you're going to find variations of that everywhere you go. Students will recite it back to you like it's a catechism in Sunday school, and they'll have a sweet smile on their face. Isn't it wonderful to live in America where no branch ever has more power than it's supposed to? I think that's a little too strongly stated. So again, my question for today, and we'll come back to this over and over, is are the checks and balances working today? Do checks and balances work? It's a theory that was advanced back in the 18th century, and it's one that we live under today. And so the big question is it working? And I don't want to get ahead of myself and give you a spoiler, but I think if you had a team wrestling with this question, and we'd never have a question this spare in We the People, but or this direct. If you had a team wrestling with this, I think you could easily make the case that checks and balances have worked in the United States. There have been instances where abuses of power or excessive use of power has been stopped, but you could also very easily have a team that says checks and balances have not worked, and here's a whole list of instances where they have not kept people from doing things that they want to do. And of course, if you're a slick, your team could have some members say, I disagree with my colleague and yada, 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 because there is ample evidence on both sides. So it doesn't admit of a pat answer that's either yes or no. Okay, next. Hope you guys are hanging in there with me. So I've sort of hinted that I have a problem with too much faith in checks and balances. That's an extreme view. And it's one that people fall into, I think, much too readily. So to the extent that you can, and each of you is teaching at a different level, and I don't want you to, I don't know, deflate your kids' belief in the American system. That's not the goal. But there is such a thing as being too positive. This notion that the checks and balances work automatically, perfectly, unerringly, so that if ever one branch ever considers doing something that's out of line, the other two branches are going to swoop into action like the Super Friends and make sure that it never becomes more than just a bad idea. It doesn't work that way. In real life, we know that it doesn't work that way. I put up a screwy word up there. Panglossian is a word for being overly complacent or satisfied. It comes from Voltaire, and Voltaire wrote in his masterwork Candide that, well, there is a character in Candide named Professor Pangloss, and it was, the whole book was poking fun at the excessive optimism of the Enlightenment. And Professor Pangloss is the embodiment of that. He says, everything works out for the best in this, the best of all possible worlds. And so if you want to insist that everything works out for the best in the American political system, you don't need to compete in We the People. You don't even need to be on this call right now. You don't need to teach your students, because the system works on its own like a perpetual, years ago I used to talk about the Ron Popeil Showtime rotisserie oven, where you would just set it and forget it and it would fix any problem by itself. And that's flatly not the way it works. And so if you fall into that kind of circular reasoning where, think about this for a moment. What if I said that American elections are amazing because the right person always wins? And you said, well, that doesn't sound right. What about so-and-so? And I'd say, well, she won, didn't she? She must have been the right person. Thank you very much. My work here is done. I mean, you can't use, everything can't be used to explain every outcome. You can't say that under all conditions, everything is just right. That's what Professor Pangloss would say. But that's really, that's not the kind of critical analysis that a citizen, a skeptical citizen, ought to use. Imagine if during the history of our nation, one branch tripled in power compared to what the founders intended. It wouldn't make sense to say, well, they must have needed it and it must have been appropriate, because if it wasn't appropriate, the other branches would have stopped it in its tracks. Obviously, there's been a change in the mix between the three branches over 230 years. But the idea that at every moment in American history, it was exactly right for that moment, just doesn't, it just seems like a way of not thinking about something as opposed to thinking about something. Okay, I'm not going to beat that dead horse any further. The alternative, and you don't hear this idea as much in Indiana as when I was teaching in other places in America, but some people will say checks and balances have never worked. Elections are a sham. The political system is rigged. Maybe you've heard that. There is a lot of cynicism now. I mean, the country is in a real disorderly mood and a cynical mood. I'm sure you know this. But the idea that it's irredeemably bad, it never gets improved, I think that's an unproductive view as well. That's an extreme view that doesn't really admit for what I see as the role of the citizen. It's much more sensible to say sometimes, under some conditions, checks and balances work, and sometimes they just don't. And there are certain situations or circumstances or conditions that contribute to that. And if you don't like that fact, then there's something you can do about it as a citizen, and that is to be informed and engaged. And so if you adopt any of these extreme views that it doesn't need to be fixed ever, or it can never be fixed, then a citizen might as well opt out. You don't need to know what's happening because there's nothing you can do about it. But I believe very deeply, maybe too deeply, that citizens can do something about it if they know the system and know the facts. And so I think there's got to be a sensible middle. And there's dozens of people on this phone call right now. And I don't think that there's one position that we should all agree on. We're all likely to be somewhere on a spectrum, somewhere between the one pole and the other. And we can, as smart people, talk about why one position is better than the other. But this idea that there's nothing we can do or there's nothing that needs to be done, I just think is too much. All right, so far so good. I hope we haven't lost dozens of people. Okay. Now, if you're teaching this stuff, you know this stuff, and you know that there's an American affection for the study of the founding period. There's no shortage of books, terrific books about the founding era, the drafting of the Constitution in Philadelphia, the ratification struggle afterwards. And so I'm not going to go too deep on this, but just to set the stage before we speed up. There's no doubt that when they convened in Philadelphia in May of 1787, they were headed to a private secret meeting where the order of business turned very quickly to designing a system of government that was much, much more powerful than the one that preceded it. So the Articles of Confederation had a weak central government. And so job one was, how can we design a national government, a central government that has a lot more power than we had otherwise, that we had at the time. Things like the power to tax, power to regulate commerce, power to raise an army, negotiate with other nations, yada, yada, yada. So it's a big deal. It's a major effort to try to design a government and give it power to run this sprawling nation. The men who came together in Philadelphia, 55 men, obviously had different backgrounds, different outlooks, but they were all sort of a product of the era of the Enlightenment, the 17th and 18th century notion of skepticism and empiricism. They had read the classics, they had thought about history, and what they had understood is that very often political systems devolve into bad situations, despotism, tyranny, anarchy, and under those kinds of arrangements, the rights of the people, the liberties of the people suffer. And so one of the things they were fearful of was having too much power in too few hands. So we're going to create a very powerful government, but we understand from history and from philosophy that too much power in too few hands is dangerous. So we have to figure out a way to get around that. And of course, what they came up with was checks and balances, which is our topic for today. Locke is one of the places that came from, but more than any other thinker, that's Montesquieu, the Baron of, I think it's Philippe Secondat de Montesquieu, a nobleman from France who wrote a variety of things, the Persian Letters, the Spirit of the Laws. And in the Spirit of the Laws, L'Esprit des Lois, he writes about the sensible way to divide power is by function. It's almost like a Henry Ford idea, an assembly line. So you make the law, you execute the law, and then you decide whether the law is consistent with our basic founding law, legislative, executive, and judicial. And Madison, who is a prime mover, in many ways the founder, the father of the Constitution, he talks about we're creating something, it's almost like machinery, and we're informed by a new science of politics. And so we're going to try this Montesquieu style separation of powers. Of course, it's not brand new because the states had, in their own ways, in their constitutional arrangements, similar divisions in the legislature or between the executive and the legislative. And so that's in the backdrop. They had all read the classics and they were familiar with history. And then I returned to this idea that's in the We the People textbook. It's ever present in Madison and in other writings of the founders, but Madison is unmistakable about it. Look at Federalist 51. In a Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. And so the notion was we're going to design a national government with 3 branches, but one will stand above all the others. And the imprint of that idea is obvious once you get past the preamble, because in Article 1, you have this long, exhaustive list of things that the legislature is going to do, the powers that it will exercise. And if that's not enough, you get to the end of that list, and then you find yourself at the necessary and proper clause, which says, if there's anything we didn't think of, they can do that too. Thank you very much. So Article 1 reveals how the centerpiece of this government will be the legislature. That's because it's close to the people. And we're designing a Republican government that's meant to reflect the views of the people, not directly, obviously, not slavishly, but through some sort of refining process. And then the other 2 branches are there. I use the word co-equal. They're not equal in size or power, but they're co-equal in as much as they operate in the same system, and they have the ability to slow or to stop some actions of Congress. But man, you look at Article 2, the executive is described in very vague language. It's much shorter than Article 1. And it says the executive power will be vested in a president. I don't even know what that means. He's going to do president stuff. Half of Article 2 is about how we're going to pick the president. A lot of this came at the very end. They started in May, they wrapped it up in September, and they kept putting it off because the executive was a branch that they weren't quite sure about. They had some disagreements about the composition, about the powers, about the limits on the powers, and so they put it off to the end. And then by comparison, Article 3 is even shorter. I think you could put it on a postage stamp. We're going to have courts. We'll get back to you later on this. And so after ratification, a lot of time was spent trying to put meat on the bones of the vague structures hinted at in the Constitution. So everything is about the Congress. Madison talks about Congress is going to predominate, and as a result, it needs to be checked. And that's why we're going to have bicameralism. That's why they're going to be selected to serve terms of different lengths, and they will serve different constituencies. And if you zoom out to all the branches, I mean, I talked about Madison and the science of politics. It's pretty ingenious if you think about it. A House member has a different constituency than a Senate member. For most of our history as a nation, senators were unelected. And so they served longer terms, they served more people, they were selected by different people, state legislatures. The president was selected by the Electoral College on a different timetable from senators. And then of course the judges were selected in an entirely different way. And so the notion was collusion, conspiracy, designing. They always use the word designing. People with evil designs. It's very hard to collaborate across such a massive nation because the people are not in communication with each other, and the leaders of the government are not beholden to the same constituencies or serving on the same timetables. I'm going to come back to this in a second, but I just wanted to lay that out to you. And then finally, the last thing is in Philadelphia from May to September. Not only was it a rough ride and a difficult period, very contentious, but once they were done, the hard work was not over because they had to report back to the Congress under the Articles of Confederation. And if they got their approval, they had to send it out to the states and the state ratifying conventions. And at least 9 states had to ratify it. And so they had to have a proposition that was more appealing and less risky. And so there's a lot of stuff in the Constitution that is put there on purpose to make it appealing so that it can get passed. All right. Why don't I take a breath at this point, and Tim, if there's anybody who is desirous of asking something, otherwise I can go forward.
I haven't seen anything come into the chat box other than, since you posed the question at the very beginning, Stephanie wanted to call you Mr. Checks and Balances. So that can be your nickname if that's what you think there.
Well, feel free to interrupt me anytime.
I sure will if I see something pop in.
Back in the 50s, before I was born, they had a lot of gimmicks at the movie theaters. So they had, scratch and sniff, and they had 3D. And there was one movie where they had put electricity in the seats and they would zap you. And that's what I think we need to do. If I get too boring, what we need is Tim zapping the chairs all across the state of Indiana. Okay, I'll make this one shorter. But obviously...
Actually, you know what, Dr. Dion? I'm going to interrupt before you get started in the next piece. But so, because one did just come in. Mark was asking a question. I guess, Mark, do you want to go ahead and unmute and ask that directly too?
So, Dr. Dion, you talked about Madison's belief in a stronger legislature, but wasn't he really leery of the state legislatures at the time under the Articles? So I'm just kind of curious how that balances out there.
Ah, yeah, that is a terrific question. So my answer would be that many of the state legislatures were were too democratic, and were overrun by this sort of revolutionary, post-revolutionary fervor, and motivated by a desire to reallocate or redistribute property. And so they had kind of gotten out of control. And the thing that made Madison, if you read Federalist 51, the thing that makes him less worried about that at the national level is this notion that it's going to be at some remove from the people. It's different from a state legislature because it's far away. And so he talks in the Federalist Papers about the way that the national legislature will refine and enlarge public sentiment. So they're not going to just follow it slavishly with a gun to their head. They're going to refine and enlarge, and they're going to think of the national interest as opposed to the sort of parochial interest. That's my rough answer, is that there was a great fear that many of the states were devolving into disorder and anarchy because they were too responsive to the populace. And there's a whole lot of anti-democratic or undemocratic elements woven in to the design of the national constitution. When you think about the three branches, only half of one is truly democratic. And even truly democratic is a stretch because not everybody could vote. But the Senate is unelected, the courts are unelected, the president's not directly elected. So there's no earthly way that the House by itself is going to go and run amok in the way that the state legislatures had. And the state legislatures, depending on which one, some of them had certain weaknesses. Either the executive was too strong or too diffuse or whatever. And so he was trying to correct for that. I hope that's a halfway decent answer. I'm looking at you because I can see your face on there. Any other questions? I'm moving ahead. The last thing I said was they had to get this past the states. And the Congress was not thrilled when they revealed it, because that's not what they were supposed to do. They weren't supposed to write a constitution, but they did. And so there was really harsh pushback, really spirited anti-federalist debates across the country. And one of the places where you see that is in Virginia. If you get a chance to look this up, Patrick Henry had a real rip-roaring attack on the Constitution in the Virginia Convention. And he is as patriotic as an American as you can find. And he said, let me read this, quote, "There will be no checks, no real balances in this government. What will avail your specious imaginary balances, your rope dancing, chain rattling, ridiculous ideal checks and contrivances?" So he's not a fan of Madison's new science of politics. He sees it as a big fat power grab that will infringe on the liberties of citizens. And Patrick Henry is no joke in Virginia. And in New York, which was a very, very, very tough state. Alexander Hamilton's from there, but so too is George Clinton and others. And it was a heavy lift in New York. The Federalist essays, all 85 of them, were directed to the state of New York. And they're, I don't want to say they're exaggerated, but they are exaggerated. They over promise in many respects, mostly because it was such a tough audience. And among others, there's a guy named Brutus. Well, it's a pseudonym. And Brutus says, there's something undemocratic and dangerous to liberty in the design of this judicial branch. And there never really was a satisfactory answer. Alexander Hamilton tried in the Federalist Papers to say, tut, tut, you're not gonna, nothing bad will ever happen in the courts. But Brutus said, man, if you empower this independent, powerful judiciary, bad things can happen. And so there was widespread doubt about how natural or automatic or how perfect this system would work. Madison goes out of his way and he says in Federalist 51, the way we've set it up, the only time anybody would ever agree would be for the common good. And they'll never agree to do anything bad, so not to worry. That's a little bit overstated. So these are early critics of the Constitution, the separation of powers, and checks and balances. And just, if you're interested, I want to signal to you a later critic, and that's Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson's very much in the news today because people are disavowing him for some really despicable racial views. Before he was president, he was a university president at Princeton, and before he was a president, he was a political science professor, a student of American government. And before that, he was a racist and remained a racist. But he wrote a book called Congressional Government when he was a professor. And it reveals a common thread in American political science, and that is that maybe we overdid it with respect to the checks and balances. We made it too hard to do anything, that we tend towards gridlock. We trend away from responsibility and accountability. The word responsibility in American political science means, does the government respond to what the people want? Are they accountable? And what Wilson says in Congressional Government is that the authority is so divided that you don't know who to punish. And I know you guys can see this point, because imagine if you're upset with the government today. Is that Donald Trump's fault? Is it Nancy Pelosi's fault? Is it Mitch McConnell's fault? If you want to punish the bad guys and reward the good guys, which party do you vote for? And so very often in American political science, there is a school of thought which says that most democracies on earth are parliamentary governments, where there is the absence of this kind of checks and balances or separation of powers. If you don't like the government and what they're doing, you cashier them all. And by definition, you know, Boris Johnson is the Prime Minister of the UK because his party, the Tories, the Conservatives, are in power. Justin Trudeau is Prime Minister of Canada because the Liberal Party controls the House of Commons. You can't have Donald Trump at one end of Pennsylvania and Nancy Pelosi at the other end if you have a parliamentary government. And so if you don't like the direction the country's going, you can say, well, we're going to try somebody different. And you might throw this in front of your students at some point. I can send Tim a very brief reading from a textbook I have from Congressional Government, where he lays out the idea that you would actually empower citizens to keep their government on a short leash and reward them for good activity and punish them for bad activity if we didn't have these doggone separation of powers and checks and balances. Of course, I keep saying that checks and balances is part of American dogma, and it's almost like blasphemy. I think you'd get an interesting rise out of your students if you were to throw this idea in front of them, because we have all been trained that the alternative to checks and balances is tyranny, right? We have checks and balances to protect us against tyranny. If you take away checks and balances, you will have tyranny, like they have in Canada under Justin Trudeau. Anyway, that was a joke. Maybe Boris Johnson is a tyrant, but I'm not sure that Justin Trudeau and his beard are tyrannical. Okay. So speaking of tyranny, James Madison, who's not the author of most of the Federalist essays, but author of many of the most important ones, the most timeless, he says, the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. If you want to look in the Federalist essays, there's 85 of them. I don't recommend that you read all 85 for this unless you're a real go-getter. I don't recommend that you have your students read all 85 because they are a challenging read. The language is not always self-evident to a 21st century reader, but the mother lode for checks and balances is 47, 48, 49, 50, 51. If you read those, and especially 51, 51 is the one I've been teaching for years, there is a rich array of stuff in there. A really pure, spirited defense, maybe a little bit overstated, as I said, but a strong defense and explanation of how checks and balances are meant to work. All right, so 47, he gives you the definition of tyranny. And that's collecting all power into too few hands. In 51, he says, we're not going to have that, and let me walk you through how that works. All right. Now here is my list of defenses against tyranny that one encounters in the American political system. So if tyranny is to be avoided, and tyranny, I think we can all agree, is bad. If tyranny is to be avoided, what elements of the American political system will help to protect us from it? And it's worth mentioning that one of those is self-restraint. And if you read Unit 1, the word that will come up more often is virtue, civic virtue. And the founders were not unmindful of the importance of civic virtue. In fact, there was an expectation that, this goes back to Mark's question, there's a difference between the mass public and elite leadership, and the elite leaders have more virtue. They're less parochial, more national, more civic-minded. At least that's what Madison tried to say. So we don't want to ignore the notion that self-restraint matters. I hate to tell you this, but in the last couple years, political leaders have exhibited less self-restraint and less virtue, and I think that's a problem. I'll send to Tim, and I'll direct to you guys a quote that's from, I want to say 1777, right around the time of our independence, and it's from the leader of the Scottish Enlightenment, David Hume, H-U-M-E. David Hume said, before we even wrote our Constitution, you might as well assume that every man is a knave. Every man is a knave interested in his own betterment, his own advancement. And so if you put your faith in self-restraint and virtue, you're going to come to ruin. And obviously Madison and George Mason, who said the same thing, they all said that self-restraint is good. It will be in evidence among our leaders, but it's not the backstop that we can rely on. And so we're going to build into the system checks and balances that are activated by other branches. And as I said in passing, these other branches will be constituted in such a way that they're elected, if they are elected, on a different timetable, and they'll be responsive to a different constituency. So that the likelihood that they will collude will be diminished. They're not going to work together because they have different motivations and different timetables. And so the bulk of what we're going to do today is the design of these other branches to step in the event that self-restraint goes out the window. But wait, there's more. Federalism. If you look at Federalist 51, Madison talks about checks and balances, but he also says that we will have, in addition to that, state power. State power is not going to go away. We're not abolishing or absorbing the states. We're going to have a condition of dual sovereignty. So a person will be a citizen of North Carolina and a citizen of the United States, and there'll be two constitutions, two sets of laws, and one way to make sure that the national government doesn't go nuts or run amok or run roughshod over the rights of citizens is that we will retain this federalist arrangement, and states will have muscle that they can flex. Between you and me, that hasn't happened. I think we can agree in the 21st century that states are not restraining national government power. They're not equal. There's a lot that's in the Constitution that argues against that, the supremacy clause. The anti-federalists, before we ratified, they said, this is poppycock. When Madison and others, Publius, say that states will rein in the federal government, that will never happen. We're going to have a standing army, we're going to have national taxes, and the states will wither. And that's precisely what happened in the last 200 years. So that sort of proposed check from the states on the national government didn't work out. In Federalist 51, Madison also talks about the people as the ultimate fountain of authority. This is a Republican government. It's a thing of the people. And at the end of the day, the most important thing is what the people want. And so the will of the people, public opinion as reflected in the government, elections. Of course, again, the problem is the Senate's not elected, the president's not directly elected, the courts are not elected. So the only forum for reflecting popular will is the House until, what is it, 1913, when we elected the Senate, and changes in the Electoral College over time. But still, here's Madison. The natural cure for an ill administration in a popular or representative constitution is a change of men. And how do you change leaders? Very often it's the people. The people through one means or another. So the Senate may be removed from direct popular control for most of our history as a nation, but we do have state legislatures who are elected, and their job is to select senators. And so if the people get good and mad, they can figure out a way to change the composition of the Senate. And then by extension, the Senate can figure out a way over time to change the composition of the judicial branch. And so the people are the ultimate fountain of authority. Madison, at the beginning of Federalist 51, makes a nod to that fundamental idea that in a Republican government, the people are the ultimate fountain of authority. But, he says, history has taught us that we need auxiliary precautions. We need other protections beyond the people. We can't just count on the people to be active and engaged, especially in a sprawling nation of 4 million people stretched across the Atlantic seaboard. We can't rely on the virtue of our leaders. We know now that we can't rely on the states to keep the national government in check. So really the strongest of the checks here is the other branches, the checks and balances system. And then finally, it's worth noting that when they wrote the Constitution, we didn't have political parties, but political parties emerged in the United States. They are an American invention. We have the first parties in the world, the oldest parties in the world, modern political parties. And almost immediately after ratification, during the Washington administration, you get disagreements between Adams and Hamilton on the one side, and Madison and Jefferson on the other, over foreign policy, over domestic policy, over the size and scope of the government. And they start organizing, and I don't think it's fair to call them true parties in the 18th century, but they're proto-parties. They're the beginnings of parties. To my mind, you don't really get true political parties until you have the mass extension of the franchise, which comes later at the beginning of the 19th century, 1824 and beyond. But political parties play a very interesting role, and it's a mixed role. And I hope I can explain this in a way that makes sense. On the one hand, Wilson and others say that power is scattered across branches. branches that are elected on a different timetable with different constituencies, different orientations. And so power is scattered, and Madison says that means we'll be safe from collusion. But political parties, when they emerge, allow for unity across branches. And we've seen it now. You see it in the world around us. So political parties undo some of that separation. Political parties make it so that President Trump talks to Mitch McConnell. President Trump talks to Kevin McCarthy. And so they work across branches. They have shared interests. Donald Trump works with Mitch McConnell to put Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court. Brett Kavanaugh, who used to work for a Republican president. That's political parties at work. So it sort of undermines, on the one hand, checks and balances. It undermines the institutional self-defense, where Congress should push back against a president who wants to flex his muscle. But if you have political parties, they may not want to push back against a president. They may agree with a president. There's a terrific article in the Harvard Law Journal. I can send Tim the link. But the idea is that especially under a condition of unified party control, if Congress and the presidency are under the same party control, then checks and balances really are out the window. But man, if you've got divided government, such as we have now with Nancy Pelosi in the House as Speaker, then checks and balances are more likely to be in evidence, because Nancy Pelosi, let's just say, does not agree with Donald Trump and his policy agenda. And we saw that when she ripped up his speech at the State of the Union. So it was unmistakable. So political parties sort of undo checks and balances in one respect, but on the other hand, there's a whole line of scholarship that suggests that the emergence of political parties and the competing for control of the government into an arrangement of what the British call government and opposition, or the in party and the out party, that actually in and of itself, political parties become an instrument of checks and balances. I hope you followed that. Sorry, I know it's early in the morning on a Tuesday in the summer and it's raining in Evansville. But the notion here is the party that's out of power wants to block, wants to reveal the weaknesses of the party that's in power so that it can capture power. And so that becomes a check. It's not the only check or the totality of it, but it becomes a way to spotlight for the people the deficiencies in the government and possibly direct their attention to an alternative. So those are the checks. And again, civic virtue by itself, it's not going to cut it. Federalism has withered on the vine. The people, I hate to tell you this, most people in America would fail a civics test. Most people in America don't vote in most elections. And so, yikes. Political parties, today we are in a highly polarized condition, but more often than not, that leads to gridlock as opposed to a more positive outcome. So our best hope against tyranny is the other branches. And so that's where we're headed. What do you say, Tim? Do you have another question or comment?
I do. A few have popped in here. Zach, do you want to go ahead and ask yours if you're able to pop on the audio, or?
Yeah, I was just thinking about like the different interpretations of powers and checks and balances, and just wanted to see if you could like go into the different interpretations of like executive power at the Philadelphia Convention and that influence on how the role of the executive branch has changed in the past.
That's where I'm headed. So that's,
oh yeah, perfect.
But yeah, there's no doubt that at the convention, there were people who said we got to have a plural executive, a council. The executive has to be selected by the legislature so that he's not too independent. But on the other hand, we don't want him too dependent. We want the original there was such fear that we would fall into monarchy or dictatorship that the original notion was that the president would be second fiddle, always. Some really terrific scholars of the presidency talk about the president as the chief clerk. His job is to carry out the instructions of Congress. And so he was never meant to be the big dog that he is today. He's the 800-pound gorilla in the American political system. He eats up all the oxygen. I'm not just talking about Trump. I mean, any president in our lifetime looms large. But that's not what was expected. And of course, the other thing that's worth mentioning is, as they're trying to hammer out how much power the president should have, everybody in the room knew that the president was going to be George Washington. And they didn't know how long that would be. Hamilton wanted it to be for life, but Washington didn't, obviously. And so a lot of the theoretical concerns about excessive executive power were being argued in the backdrop of looking at George Washington and his wig and the notion that he could never tell a lie or do anything bad. But yeah, there's no clear guidance that they were of one mind. And that's why they kept putting it off. They had what was it, a committee on postponed matters or irreconcilable dilemmas or whatever they called it. And then they said, heck with it. And they kind of rushed it through at the end. And Article 2 to me is, I don't want to be mean, but it's not the most admirable part of the Constitution. It's very vague, and it has allowed mischief over the years because people have interpreted it in ways that are just wildly different. So I like the way you asked that there were different interpretations at the beginning of executive power, and even today there are wildly different interpretations. For what it's worth, if you're really interested in a stark contrast, go back 100 years or so and look at Teddy Roosevelt and Taft. Taft believed in a modest, not passive, but a very limited role for the president. And of course, Teddy Roosevelt was like Miley Cyrus. He couldn't be tamed. I mean, he was larger than life. He wanted to do everything yesterday. And they're both serving in the same office. And Article 2 and the political conditions that surrounded government at the dawn of the last century allowed for TR to really be a big deal. That's my answer to that question.
Thank you, Dr. Dion. Got another one from Jill. Do you got a second to pop on your audio, Jill?
I sure do. So, Dr. Dion, you were talking about parties being the check on the sitting government. And not just recently, but over years, I'm starting to wonder now if it's really that parties are checking each other or if it's the media. Because the media is the arm and what they create in the check more so than the actual political parties checking one another from the outside.
Yeah, I have two answers. And that is a terrific observation. I mean, one of the arguments during ratification was that we were too big a country to be governed, that the people wouldn't have a shared sense or whatever. And now obviously we're much bigger, way over 300 million, and the territory is bigger. But technology now allows us to learn things more readily. In my parents' day, they would watch the news, Huntley and Brinkley at supper time, or get the newspaper on the door in the morning. But now we've got Twitter 24 hours a day. And so you're absolutely right that the media in and of itself is a watchdog on the government. It's supposed to be. But the definition of political parties, this goes back to a guy named E.E. Schatzschneider. He says there's three aspects of party. There's party in the government, party in the electorate, and then there's party as an organization. And so Rona Romney McDaniel is the head of the RNC. That's the organization. But the party in the government are Republican members of Congress. And you're exactly right that Mitch McConnell can do things all by himself, but the Republicans in Congress are empowered insofar as they can get the public riled up. And so there's always a way an effort to try to reach out to the party in the electorate, even between elections. to try to generate grassroots support and expression. So yeah, the media, it's a medium. It's a transmission belt for information between elite party leaders and members of the mass public who are partisans. So yeah, all by themselves, they're an independent watchdog, but they also serve as a forum for information to be transmitted. Of course, there's a lot of people who don't like the media. And so the president and others have used social media to get around that, get past the filter of news coverage, news analysis, and just tweet directly to his followers. So yeah, we don't want to ignore the media. The other thing that I'm going to capitalize on, because you gave me a chance to think about it, is everybody at the beginning talked about how parties and factions are bad news. They are to be avoided. They are an evil. Washington says as much in his farewell address. But Washington and Adams and Hamilton create the first party, the Federalist Party, and then Jefferson and Madison and the rest, they create the opposition party, although they didn't think it was a party. And getting back to the media, there was the Gazette of the United States, which was paid for, I think, I can never keep these straight. There was the National Gazette and the Gazette of the United States, and one of them was paid for with government subsidies from Hamilton's Secretary of the Treasury post. And the other one was paid for with excess money that Jefferson had as Secretary of State. And they both became partisan organs that would either complement the government or criticize the government in power. And so the press from the beginning of the Republic has been a way to convey partisan views or the views of partisans to the mass public. And Madison, I wrote this down. I thought I wrote this down. Wait a minute. Madison writes in the National Gazette that was edited by Philip Freneau, parties are an evil, factions are an evil, but we can combat that evil by making one party a check on the other. So even 200 something years ago, James Madison in print, in a newspaper, with a very limited audience, obviously. That's why it needed to be subsidized by government funds. He talks about parties acting as a check on the abusive actions of the other party. So this is a very old idea of parties being a check. Terrific questions. I'm not disappointed as always because you guys are a smart bunch. I wish I had 3 more hours.
Let me get one more question in before we let you continue, because time will keep running short. So Patrick, do you have a chance to kind of ask your question there?
Yeah, so I just kind of thinking through what you were talking about with Washington. You know, they knew that he would be the first president. Is there any mixed message about the power the executive should have with this larger-than-life figure that immediately steps into the branch? And we always look at him as having set great precedents, but we also, you know, like you were saying, he had the self-restraint that maybe many of our presidents throughout history have not had. He tried to set that example. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
In another room, I have a book, and if I remember, I'll send the link to Tim, and maybe he can pass it along. But there's a terrific book by a historian that looks at almost the deification of George Washington. You talk about larger than life. He was a national hero, an international rock star. He was portrayed in ways that make him superhuman. And so we had a cult of personality right out of the gate. And I guess what you're making me think of is that there was a danger of this sort of outsized executive with, like I say, a cult of personality. The thing that helps enormously is that he steps down willingly after 2 terms, as you suggest, and he sets a remarkable precedent. And then, I don't want to be mean, but he was replaced by his rotundity, John Adams, and so there was a lot less hero worship and a greater willingness to, you know, poke holes at Adams from Jefferson's camp. And Jefferson is a remarkable man too, but nobody ever really ranks as high as Washington, at least in my view, until you get to Lincoln. And then Lincoln, of course, is the person about whom there are more books written than anybody else. And so, yeah, Washington really is sort of a sui generis on this. There's nobody else like him. And his example of stepping down and relinquishing power is a really strong message that we're going to be a republic and not a proto-monarchy. There was a lot of fear. Jefferson said, I think that the presidency under the Constitution looked like a Polish king. Maybe that was Edmund Randolph. Or Randolph said that it was the fetus of monarchy. It was dangerous. And Washington helped us to understand that it didn't have to be dangerous. But having said all that, I don't want to overstate that. Even while Washington was president, and even though he was largely untouchable, man, early on, I mean, when he declared neutrality, that was a big deal. Congress didn't like it. They ordered him to come and appear, and he says, I'm not going to do it. They tried to cut off funding for the Jay Treaty, and he very nearly failed in Congress. He was able to muscle through a slim majority. So I don't want to suggest that it was all sweetness and light. The era of good feelings came later, when the Federalists collapsed and then only the Jeffersonians remained. And even that era of good feelings didn't last forever. I hope that was a halfway decent answer. I'm mindful of the time, and I want to tear through this. I'm getting finally to the meat. I mean, we've been fiddling with crudité for a while, and now we're getting to the big slab of meat that's coming, and I'm mindful that we don't have all the time in the world. But I'm confident that the terrific mentors will step up and outdo me. I'm just the checks and balances champion here, the cheerleader. Are we ready, Tim?
All yours.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to ignore the legislature and drill down on the courts and the presidency. And really, the presidency is the most important. And I may have to go too quickly on this, but I can send you this and you can look at it on your own. Let's see what we have here. The power of the courts is not very detailed, it's very vague. Of course, in colonial times, there were bad experiences with the judges that were there representing the king, but not a whole lot of thought was put into Article 3, to be dead honest with you. There were some people who freaked out that these people would serve for life and that they were unelected and that they had supreme in the name of the institution in which they served. That would be scary to anybody who was worried about liberty. But Hamilton famously says, look, they have neither the power of the sword nor the power of the purse. They're the least dangerous branch. Early on, Justice Marshall asserts judicial review, but there's a really interesting analysis by Bruce Ackerman. And Ackerman says, you got to look at Marbury in the context of the other decisions that were being made at that time after Jefferson took power. And he doesn't suggest that it's weak or anything, but he does suggest that in the broad context, Marshall was sort of inclining himself, stepping out of the forum of political disputes, because so early in our republic, and with that first transfer of power from the Federalists to the Jeffersonians, we ran the real risk of not having an independent judiciary. So he sort of kept his powder dry and meekly asserted a power that we didn't use again for decades afterwards. And so if you look at the grand sweep of American history with respect to checks and balances, protecting against tyranny, there's not a whole lot of tyranny coming out of the courts for most of our history because they don't do a heck of a lot. Of course, Dred Scott is an embarrassment. It's one of the worst decisions. They're merely affirming what was already in the air. It's not that the Supreme Court created slavery, but they did not knock it down. Now, obviously, the world that we live in today and the world that emerged from the 50s and 60s is one in which the role of the courts is dramatically bigger. The courts, you've seen this week and then last week, all of a sudden gay people have rights under the Civil Rights Act, and The DACA move by President Trump got knocked down, and abortion laws in Louisiana were overturned, and on and on and on. I mean, the Supreme Court makes decisions that really affect everybody, and that was not the way it was for most of our history as a nation. And so if you're worried about checks on the courts, we ought to be more worried now than early on in our history, because the courts didn't do a heck of a lot for a long time. They were a sort of a weak sister or a passive partner. But here we are now, and I wish we had more time to go into this, but are there checks on the courts baked into the political system designed by Madison and his partners in Philadelphia? Absolutely. Are they meaningful in limiting the use of judicial power? That's open to debate. And I would suggest that they're not particularly effective. That's the short answer. One way that you can constrain the courts is to amend the Constitution. If the pro-life movement for years has been talking about a human life amendment. If Roe v. Wade sticks in your craw, and it's been around since 1973, then doggone it, you amend the Constitution to say that abortion is not constitutionally protected. That would bind any court. If you had 9 Ruth Bader Ginsburgs on the court, they couldn't get around a human life amendment. But you'll notice that the pro-life movement has not been able to ratify such a thing, because amendments are very, very difficult to add to the Constitution. 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, 3/4 of the states. We're going to talk about suffrage tomorrow, but it's worth noting the suffrage amendment was ratified, 19th Amendment, but the Equal Rights Amendment never was. And doggone it, it was in both party platforms. Both parties had it in their platform. And the overwhelming majority of the American people, year after year, were for it. It flew out of the House and Senate like greased lightning, and 35 states ratified it. But you need 38. And do you think we would get 38 states to deny the right to an abortion? 38 states in 2020? No. And so amendments are a powerful check if you could use it, but we really don't have a good record of using it. We've only amended the Constitution 17 times since 1791, since the Bill of Rights. The much more effective and more present notion is appointment and confirmation. And that's one way to change the composition of the court. You kind of have to wait for Father Time to do his work and get people to retire or die. Scalia died, and Thurgood Marshall retired. That's how we got Clarence Thomas. But that's a check that you have to wait on. Then you have to hope that, I mean, if the court has gone cuckoo, hypothetically, you have to wait for a sensible president who's not a kook to be present when somebody dies and pick a non-kook to replace a kook. And then you have to hope that the Senate will confirm by a majority that non-kook. The appointment process is very slow. It's lagged because people serve forever. Obama's appointments were older. Some of Clinton's appointments were older than Bush appointments and Trump appointments. But those federal judges are going to serve for a long time. My students freak out when I tell them this because if you're in your 40s and you get named to be a federal judge, you're going to be there for 30 or more years, which means my students will be in their 50s when that person starts thinking about retiring. And don't mention the 50s to a 19-year-old because they will, I mean, their eyes will pop out of their head. So yes, there is an opportunity to change the trajectory of the courts if you wait around long enough for people to die or retire. If you don't want to wait for them to die or retire, some people like Pete Buttigieg talked about plans to make it more routine to change the composition of the court. Well, you can't do that until you amend that. You have to amend the Constitution, and good luck with that. So we're back to waiting for people to retire or die. there is this notion that you could refuse to enforce a decision. That's a little creepy to me, for what it's worth. Andrew Jackson is the one that you always see. Every textbook says, the court has made its decision, now let them enforce it. And Jackson had problems too, but I don't think I want to live in a world where the only check on the courts is that we ignore them and refuse to carry out their legitimate decisions. That's really not, it's not a live issue right now. The idea that we would reject the court's decision. Now, for what it's worth, realistically, I think every member of the court is mindful of the anticipated reaction of the people and the press and the other branches. So sometimes that sort of restrains them. The We the People textbook talks about one of the checks on the courts is self-restraint. And so I think they know that if they did something too crazy, maybe it wouldn't get carried out. But realistically, I don't know that that's something that's likely to happen. I do know that when Brown was decided, the Chief Justice, Earl Warren, shopped the decision around and around, and they fiddled with it quite a bit because he said, I'm not releasing this until we have a unanimous decision. I don't want to have a divided court telling the South that they need to desegregate. And so it has to be 9-0. And so that's why they watered it down and said with all deliberate speed and whatnot, because they know that enforcement can be a challenge. But have you guys noticed that, 5 years ago, the Supreme Court said that same-sex couples can get married, and that used to be a real hot-button issue in America, and except for Kim Davis down in Rowan County, Kentucky, I mean, it came and went without a ripple. Indiana is not the most progressive state in the world, but lesbians are getting married all over the place, and everybody's mostly yawning. There was no real fight over enforcement, so I'm not sure that that's a major aspect. Another one that is sort of tangential or less central is this notion of court stripping or jurisdiction stripping. You can look this up on your own. A lot of students are surprised sometimes to learn that the Constitution allows Congress, it empowers Congress to alter the jurisdiction of the courts. And I'll send there's a study that was done by the Congressional Research Service into this, but my local congressman down here, John Hostetler, back in the day, tried to introduce this. He said the court was getting too liberal and he was going to stop them by introducing a bill in Congress. And the Republicans controlled Congress. Denny Hastert was the speaker, and Denny Hastert said, yeah, we're not doing that. We're not doing that. Because meddling in the jurisdiction, even though it's allowed by the Constitution, just has a bad look. It's interfering in the presumably non-political decision-making of the independent judiciary by a sort of a ham-fisted legislative partisan action. And it wouldn't sell well. Similarly, I think that's the next one, come on. There we go. Similarly, the Constitution allows Congress to impeach federal judges, including Supreme Court justices. I started with amendments, and I said that amendments would bind the court. They are irresistible. If you embed language in the Constitution through amendments, no judge can fight that. It's in there. It's by definition constitutional if you change the language of the Constitution. And so, put that in your pipe and smoke it. You have nowhere to turn. Another irresistible check on the court is the power of impeachment. If you think the courts are being abusive, you retain the right to remove them. Brutus writes about this. Brutus, one of the anti-federalists, writes about how the courts represent one of the greatest dangers of tyranny. And Hamilton says, well, you can impeach him. And Brutus says, yeah, well, we're not going to impeach him because you can only be impeached for being a nut or a moron or a crook, not just for making decisions you disagree with. And sure enough, I hate to tell you this, but we have never removed a Supreme Court justice in the history of America. Since the 1780s, we have never. There is a grand total of 0. So there is a powerful, irresistible check, the impeachment power. If the courts ever reached a point where Congress thought that somebody merited removal, there's no recourse, there's no appeal. It's you're out. But we've never done it. Even when you raise the prospect of doing it, most people think you're a nut. The people like the John Birch Society want to remove justices. They are on the fringe. It's not a respectable position. And it's an affront to the very notion of an independent judiciary. So are the checks working? No. Are the courts more consequential than ever before? You better believe it. Have the other branches reined them in? They sure haven't. Would it be a good thing for the other branches to flex their muscle? I don't know. I don't like the idea of, I don't know, Nancy Pelosi telling Clarence Thomas what he should do, because that's the antithesis of an independent judiciary. And so impeachment, the closest we ever got was Justice Salmon Chase. I think it's 1805. Jefferson had become president. Chase was a Federalist, and it failed. It failed in the Senate, during the Senate trial. You guys know that it's hard. You need a supermajority to remove somebody. And so now we have, I think there's, I haven't looked it up, sorry, maybe 11, 13, 15 federal judges during the history of America that have been removed for malfeasance. But it's a tiny number, federal judges, lifetime serving, federally appointed judges, but never one associate justice of the Supreme Court. And anytime you hear somebody talking about, we're going to kick that person off, that's just, it's not a live option. Some people said it when Kavanaugh got on. Kavanaugh, who was appointed by, confirmed by a 51-49 vote. Or people who say Gorsuch doesn't belong on there, that should have been an Obama appointee. Well, you know, if Joe Biden gets elected president, do you think he's going to urge the Congress to remove Neil Gorsuch? And if so, would the Senate do it? If the Senate takes control of if the Democrats take control of the Senate, do you think that's even a live option to remove Neil Gorsuch? And if they teed it up, are they going to get a 2/3 vote? No. So it's crazy talk. Don't say crazy talk in your We the People presentation, but it is crazy talk. All right. Man, I have no time, and we're just now getting to the presidency. So I'm going to say 2 quick things and then head to a conclusion. I've spoken to the Summer Institute about presidential power, and that could take 3 or more hours, and I'm afraid we've got 3 or more minutes. The locus classicus, when it comes to presidential power, is a guy named Richard Neustadt, who taught at Harvard. And Richard Neustadt said, the Constitution requires the president to work with the bureaucracy, the states, the Congress, the courts, and he really doesn't have many options for self-executing commands. He essentially has to persuade other people to do what he wants. So the famous takeaway line from Richard Neustadt is that presidential power is the power to persuade. But there's another guy at Harvard, Marvin Howell, like Mr. Howell on Gilligan. And he has written a book about power without persuasion, because in modern times, presidential power has expanded greatly, and presidents have tried to get around impediments and use unitary power, an expansive interpretation of presidential power to do what they want and get around the other branches. And in the end, the Constitution, Madison said way back when, parchment barriers will not stop excessive use of power or abuses of power. Parchment barriers, what we need is to make ambition counteract ambition, So he sets up the checks and balances, but presidential power has expanded greatly over the history of this nation. Every president, Obama, Trump, Bush, Clinton, Nixon, they have all pushed the envelope as far as they possibly can, and they do whatever they can get away with. And more often than not, they don't get stopped. And this is a dispiriting way to end, because the suggestion is that checks and balances are not particularly effective. Let me show you just the quickest, because I know we're out of time. And Tim, you give me the hook when you have to. But presidents have the veto power. Early on, presidents didn't use them very frequently, and now they use them a little more. Can you check the veto? Absolutely. We have the opportunity to override. It virtually never happens. The prospect of overriding a veto is very thin. Executive orders are the province of the president, and unless the courts knock it down, and the courts are often very loath to step into something that's a political dispute between the elected branches. They tend to stay out of it. Executive orders will stand, because if the courts don't knock it down, then Congress has to do it. And Congress would do that by passing a law undoing the executive order, which by definition the president would veto, which sets up an override, which requires a 2/3 vote. So the president has all the advantages. He even has, Jill talked about the media. The president has the bully pulpit. He has a better way to speak to the people. The textbook talks about the president's appointment power, and the check on the appointment power is the confirmation process. But you can count on the fingers of one hand the number of presidential appointments that don't make it. Think about Betsy DeVos. I know it's a room full of teachers. Betsy DeVos was highly unpopular, but she's our Secretary of Education. It's very hard to convince the Senate to vote down somebody the president wants. Donald Trump has named hundreds of federal judges, judges that some that have been ruled as unqualified by the American Bar Association, but they're going to serve for life. We have treaties are in the Constitution, but presidents 95% of the time rely on executive agreements that go around the Senate, usually with the complicit support of the Senate. The Senate doesn't kick up a fuss about this. There's nothing you can do about the pardon power. And if you go back to the founding period, there was a great fear that the president might be a crook, and he might say, hey, go murder that person and I'll pardon you later. Go rob that bank and I'll pardon you, it'll be just fine. Thank goodness that hasn't happened, but if it did, there's nothing you can do about it. The pardon power is absolute. War powers is a whole thorny area. It is fair to say that Congress has been incapable of reining in the president with respect to war powers. I'll say two quick things about this, Tim, and then I'll race to a conclusion. Is that all right? I hope it's all right. Two quick things about the war powers. The courts, if you look at Hamdi versus Rumsfeld, the courts have said wartime is not a blank check for presidents to run roughshod over the rights of citizens. So the courts are our last hope, because man, Congress is not. And the founders wanted Congress to be the driver of decisions about war making, which missiles we're going to have, how many troops we're going to have, whether we go to war or not. Those are all congressional decisions. And then the president is supposed to lead the troops. But in actual fact, the War Powers Resolution has been a paper tiger. In 2006, when the Democrats roared back into power in Congress after a dozen years, largely on the backs of the unpopularity of the war in Iraq, people said to Nancy Pelosi, are you going to impeach the president? She said, no, that's a stupid idea. It would be politically unpopular and we couldn't remove him. That's the next one, by the way, is impeachment. How many presidents have we removed through impeachment? Zero. Only Nixon, who had the sense to resign. But we didn't remove Clinton or Trump or Andrew Johnson. So Pelosi said, I can't stop the war in Iraq through impeachment. I can't stop the war in Iraq through activating the War Powers Resolution because George W. Bush and Dick Cheney have said they won't honor it. And the only ace in the hole then is the power of the purse, which Congress retains. And Congress could say, well, we're just going to cut off funding for troops in the field. And that would be politically disastrous, especially for Democrats. Democrats had been out of office for 12 years. And if the first thing they did was to cut off funding for troops in a war, then it would be curtains for them. So Congress has been weak in comparison to the president because the president has all the benefits, all the advantages. And again, there are things here that could compel a president to do something, but Congress hasn't had the nerve or the power, the will to make it happen. So this is my conclusion. There are some examples, Hamdi versus Rumsfeld, Youngstown versus Sawyer. Presidents are much more powerful than they used to be. Courts are much more powerful, and we don't do a good job of checking courts. And Congress, for 200 years, has been gradually giving away its power willingly. If Congress would ever decide that it wanted to get back in the saddle, it has on paper certain things that it can do, some of which I think would be unsavory or difficult. But there are some that Congress could do a better job of asserting itself, believe it or not. And it's worth asking, is this what the founders intended? Things have certainly changed in 230 years. You guys have been terrific. I can't see all of you, but in my mind, you've been paying good attention. And if the questions were any indication, then my goodness, you are a group of overachievers, and I hope some of this was of some value to you this morning. And I'm happy to, if there's questions, Tim, if you want to throw a last minute question in, otherwise I know you're supposed to transition to the meetings with the mentors. 90 minutes is a long time to listen to anybody. So my hat's off to you for spending your Tuesday with me this morning.
Yeah, actually, let me throw another question or two at you that I've got queued up here. One was asked before, as you look at the president refusing to enforce, Supreme Court decision, using Jackson as the main example, but do you have any other examples of refusal to follow that checks and balances idea?
That is a good question, and I should have some, doggone it, because Jackson that's an old, tired example. It's in every, let me think about it and I'll send it in an email. How's that?
All right, sounds good.
But I mean, when you defy the courts, there's an element of lawlessness to that. It's a tin pot dictator kind of behavior. And so it's something that's not done. And that takes us back to the self-restraint or the civic virtue. We have leaders who believe in the theory of American government. And so they, even if, you've got to know that when we desegregated the schools, or like I said, when we made same-sex marriage constitutionally protected, there are tens of millions of Americans who really are bothered by that idea. But we don't descend into lawlessness because we respect the courts and we don't impeach justices. And so there aren't a whole lot of examples of presidents defying the courts. So I'll scratch around and I'll send one in an email, I promise.
And then I guess one other piece too would be, can you touch on the historical origins of the pardon power and why that was something that our founders put in the Constitution?
Oh, that's a good one too. And I'm afraid I'm not an expert on pardons, but I know that there was, among the anti-federalists, there was a real fear that this was too much power, that this was unchecked, unlimited, and that you could really have all kinds of mischief. I just read a speech by Brett Kavanaugh. This is kind of a non-answer, but bear with me. Brett Kavanaugh made a speech at the Marquette Law School on separation of powers and checks and balances. And he talks about a well-established precedent that presidents have prosecutorial discretion. This gets back to DACA. Because if you remember, the law says we have an immigration law, and the president said we ought to reform that law, and Congress didn't do it. So the president said, I'm going to issue an executive order allowing myself to prosecute it as I see fit. And I'm going to ease up on certain kinds of people because they don't represent an imminent threat to American security, the dreamers. Kavanaugh talks about this in his speech because he says, look, it's a non-starter to suggest that the president doesn't have prosecutorial discretion because it's a well-established precedent. And the founders invested in the president the power to pardon people. And if he can pardon somebody, then doggone it, he ought to be able to ease up on prosecuting, because if he wants to pardon them later, then he might as well not prosecute them now. It's an argument that I'm unfamiliar with. Like I say, I'm not an expert on pardons, but you know, presidents don't pardon a whole lot of people, and most of those are uncontroversial, especially when he pardons the turkey on Thanksgiving. But the danger is that something really squirrely could happen. I mean, the squirreliest one maybe was when Scooter Libby was, I think, chief of staff to Vice President Dick Cheney, and he got in big trouble. And George W. Bush just said, well, you don't have to worry about it. And there are people that Donald Trump could pardon in the next few years or the next few months. And Bill Clinton pardoned the husband of a financial donor. So there's some stuff that's unsavory. But usually it's for somebody who has served his or her time or got an excessively harsh sentence. But it seems like an invitation to mischief. And the argument was that it will be used sparingly, just like the veto will be used sparingly. And it was by Adams and Washington and Jefferson. That's the best answer I've got.
Oh, wonderful. I mean, from just seeing the comments in the chat and everything, Dr. Dion, your presentation was extremely well received and everybody enjoyed it. So we want to thank you for taking your time and presenting to us great insights on such an important, timely, integral concept about our government. And I know I enjoyed listening to it and just seeing the comments. I think I speak for everybody in the room. We all enjoyed listening to it. So thank you again very, very much.
Thank you. Good luck to all of you.